Now we get to the B deduction, Kant's rewritten version of the transcendental deduction in the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. Modern commentators tend to focus on the B deduction. Right? If you read contemporary Kant literature, contemporary Kant scholars, they will talk about the B deduction far more than they talk about the A deduction. So the general consensus seems to be that it is an improvement, that it is maybe clearer, maybe deeper, maybe more correct, that Kant somehow was better able in the B deduction to tell us sort of these fundamental insights of his philosophy than he did in the A deduction. Now, that does not mean, I think we find very, very quickly as we start reading paragraph 15, that it is much easier, right? Already, like, the second sentence of the A deduction is one of these gigantically long Kantian sentences that spans almost an entire page. And we might quickly get the feeling that we become lost and that we don't really know what the point is that Kant is trying to make. So let's try to get through the deduction. Let's try to read it together. And one thing that I want to emphasize here at the beginning is that this is something that is true for the critique in general, but that is especially true for the transcendental deduction, is that modern commentators do not agree on what exactly it says, what exactly the argument is, exactly how it works. There are lots and lots of discussions among Kant scholars today about what is going on in the B deduction. Now, we can't hope to get into that in any detail at all, although maybe I'll make a video about like one particular aspect of that. So what we will try to do is we will try to get a bit of a grasp of the B deduction, of what's going on here, which prepares us to, well, first of all, read on and read the rest of the critique, but also prepares us to delve into this literature if we want to, right? So that's where I wanted to get us, at the point where you can start engaging with the Kant literature, not at the point where you have sort of grasped all the discussions that there are in Kant literature. Now, talking about the B deduction, what is a hot issue in the Kant literature is how to understand its argumentative structure. And in fact, people do not agree whether it contains sort of, whether there are, well, there seem to be two halves. People agree about that, because around paragraph 20, 21, Kant tells us that, okay, we've sort of done something, and now we need to do something else. And the relation between this something and this something else, and the exact nature of this something and something else, are sort of the hot issue in Kant scholarship. Are these two steps of a single argument, so that the transcendental deduction is incomplete at paragraph 20, and we need an extra step in the argument to get to the conclusion we want to? Is the second half actually an application of the first half to space and time particularly, or something like that? Is the second half an attempt to undercut a certain confusion or wrong idea that readers might get in the first half? All of those are options that are on the table. Again, we're not going to try to sort of survey that territory, but I think it is good that you know in advance that there are all these ideas in the secondary literature, and that if you feel a little bit confused about what's going on and how everything hangs together, you are in good company. Okay, that being said, let us start at paragraph 15 on the possibility of a combination in general. So Kant, one of Kant's main terms here is going to be combination, and this is not very strange, having read the A deduction, where it was all about sort of synthesis, getting unity out of the manifold. That is what Kant's term combination is going to be talking about here. So he says that the manifold of representations can be given in an intuition that is merely sensible. So there can be a manifold of representations. So a lot of representations, I think, is how we are meant to read it here. There's a lot of representations, but they're not really a manifold maybe yet, right? They're not really sort of unified into a manifold. I don't know whether this works so well in English. I think the German word here definitely can also mean something just like there's a lot, there's a whole bunch of them, as well as the idea of this whole bunch as a unity. Okay, yet the combination of a manifold in general can never come to us through the senses, and therefore cannot already be contained in the pure form of sensible intuition. For it is an act of the spontaneity of the power of representation. And since one must call the latter understanding in distinction from sensibility, all combination, blah 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 blah, all combination is an action of the understanding. Okay, so Kant tells us here that the combination of a manifold can't come through to us through the senses. It must be an act of spontaneity, and we already know that the spontaneous faculty is the faculty of the understanding. Okay, why does Kant say that? Well, I think one of Kant's basic ideas here is that if something is given in sensibility, right, it's just there, it's just given to us, sort of as these loose elements that have to be taken together by the understanding. And of course, this is what the threefold synthesis of the A deduction try to explain to us in a lot of detail. Here, Kant sort of seems to just posit it. Why would he just posit? Why would he just claim that this combination has to be an act of the spontaneity of the power of representation, that is, an act of the understanding? Well, one way that I think we can think about that is to think about it this way. In order for the elements of intuition to be represented as a combination, right, in order for them to be represented as a combination, they have to be represented as belonging together. Right? To be a combination is not just to sort of, it is precisely not to be loose, right? And if you sort of present things in some sense together, but not really belonging together, well, that still seems to be, like, that doesn't really seem to be an advance over any original looseness. There's nothing binding these things together. There's nothing bringing them together. So we have to represent them as belonging together, right? But belonging, right, there we are immediately in the realm of the normative, in the realm of judgment, in the realm of knowledge, really, right? Which is all about combining, bringing together like elements of cognition in the ways that they belong together, right? That's what the understanding is all about. I am sort of tempted to read Kant, to use a phrase that no one, as far as I know, has ever applied to Kant, but that is bandied around in contemporary epistemology. I'm tempted to think of Kant as a kind of knowledge-first philosopher, in the sense that he conceives of us as knowers, right? What it is for us to be rational, self-conscious creatures is for us to be engaged in this process of knowledge. And it turns out that, like, the very idea of things belonging together, of things being unified, can only be understood from that point of view. I think something like that is here in the background. Okay, we're going to hear a lot more about combination when we get to the original synthetic unity of apperception in paragraph 16. Among all representations, combination is the only one that is not given through objects, but can be executed only by the subject itself, since it is an act of its self-activity. Okay, it is an act of its self-activity. Again, this is sort of the same thing, right? It is the spontaneous understanding that does it. It's an act of our self-activity. So, in the last part of paragraph 15, Kant is going to say that, okay, combination is the representation of the synthetic unity of the manifold. And then he points out that this unity, you might think you recognize it from the table of categories, but that's not the same unity, right? And I think Kant is saying that in order to make clear that where we are at is we are not at a point, and that's a good thing, we're not at a point where we're applying the categories, right? The application of the categories, we're trying to find out where we can apply the categories, what is the sort of realm in which the categories can be correctly applied, in which we are justified in applying the categories, we are at a stage before that, right? We are at the stage that Gardner, in his guidebook to the critique, calls the pre-categorical level, right? We are at a pre-categorical level of thought. We are trying to think a kind of unity that is not the unity of the categories, but that is sort of going to help us establish where the categories can be applied. The category already presupposes combination, right? If I'm applying categories, there already must be this manifold or object to which I am applying them. We're at an earlier stage, right? That is what Kant is stressing here. So we have to seek this unity someplace higher, namely in that which itself contains the ground of the unity of different concepts in judgments, and hence of the possibility of the understanding, even in its logical use. Right? If we really want to sort of get to this most abstract, highest, primordial level of human cognition, we've got to go even before the categories. Well, what is there, right? What is the highest place? That's what paragraph 16 is going to tell us, in which Kant introduces the idea of the I think. The I think must be able to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something would be represented in me that could not be thought at all, which is as much as to say that the representation would either be impossible or at least would be nothing for me. Okay, so Kant is not saying that all of my representations are accompanied by I think, right? It's not that at every moment we are sort of self-consciously thinking about our thinking, right? It's not that I'm all the time, wow, I think that I'm sitting in front of a camera and I think that I'm, saying these words about Kant's critique of pure reason. But it must be able to accompany all my representations, right? All my representations must be such that they can be taken up in self-consciousness and that I could become aware of them as belonging to that unity of my self-consciousness. And any element of my experience, that I'm not able to become aware of as something that belongs to this overall unity of my experience, that I cannot become aware of as being something that I think, is not an element of my experience at all. Right? I cannot have any representations that are like absolutely unable to be related to my own thinking self, to this I think. I should avoid the word self probably, to this I think, because if I did, well, it wouldn't be me who was thinking them, right? They would be as nothing for me. They would not be part of my consciousness, of this consciousness. Okay, so here we have some sort of general rule for anything that could possibly enter my consciousness, for all my representations. The I think must be able to accompany them, in other words, they must be relatable to a sort of unity of self that is always already presupposed in any consciousness that I might have. So, I call this unity, or I also call its unity, the transcendental unity of self-consciousness. Right? And in the A Deduction, I think Kant spoke mostly about the transcendental unity of apperception, but this is the same thing. Right? Self-consciousness and apperception is the same thing. The transcendental unity of self-consciousness. And again, the word transcendental here is indicating that this unity of self-consciousness has a transcendental role. Right? It makes something possible. In fact, it makes everything possible. Right? There wouldn't be any thought, there wouldn't be any representation, there wouldn't be any consciousness really without this transcendental unity of apperception, this transcendental unity of self-consciousness. For the manifold representations that are given in a certain intuition would not altogether be my representations if they did not altogether belong to a self-consciousness. That is, as my representations, even if I am not conscious of them as such, they must yet necessarily be in accord with the condition under which alone they can stand together in a universal self-consciousness, because otherwise they would not throughout belong to me. And here the word universal is surely supposed to indicate that it applies universally to all my experiences, not that it is sort of that we human beings all have the same self-consciousness. That I don't think that Kant is talking about that at all. Namely, this thoroughgoing identity of the apperception of a manifold given in intuition contains a synthesis of the representations and is possible only through the consciousness of this synthesis. For the empirical consciousness that accompanies different representations is by itself dispersed and without relation to the identity of the subject. Right? So Kant here again rejects maybe an empiricist idea that it is the contents of consciousness itself that create a certain kind of unity. There's no such thing, right? I mean, I'm not conscious of myself as something that accompanies all my thoughts, all my experiences. Absolutely not. It can't be something empirical that binds all my experiences together into one self-consciousness, right? That's not the right story. The right story is that it's a priori, that it's an a priori condition on having any experience at all, that it be related to this sort of original transcendental unity of self-consciousness. The latter relation therefore does not yet come about by my accompanying each representation with consciousness, but rather by my adding one representation to the other and being conscious of their synthesis. Therefore, it is only because I can combine a manifold of given representations in one consciousness that it is possible for me to represent the identity of the consciousness in these representations itself. That is, the analytical unity of apperception is only possible under the presupposition of some synthetic one. So, yes, the analytical unity of apperception, I think that Kant is talking about the fact that it's an analytic truth, right? That all my experiences are my experiences, right? That's not very interesting. But it is kind of interesting because what is necessary for this thought to actually refer to anything, for there to be all these experiences that belong to this one me, that belong to this one self-consciousness, requires a synthetic unity, requires a synthesis to take place, which is the synthesis wherein all these elements of consciousness are being taken up, are gathered together into this one single self-consciousness. And what Kant was also saying here, that this is the only way in which it is possible for me to represent the identity of the consciousness in these representations itself. Right? It is by being brought together into this one self-consciousness that I can think of them as all belonging to the same consciousness. Well, I guess that's the same thing as I just said. But I think Kant is, what he's trying to emphasize here, and he's going to say it a couple of times again, is that it might seem a completely empty claim, right? The claim that all my experiences are my experiences. They all belong to me, right? There's something of a unity about them. Yeah, sure. But this is a claim that only has any application because, we can see that the precondition for it having any application is this universal synthesis where all the experiences are taken to, referred to, belong to this one self-consciousness. So the analytic and the synthetic unity here are sort of two sides of the same coin, if you wish. Okay, we get to paragraph 17, which is titled, "The principle of the synthetic unity of apperception is the supreme principle of all use of the understanding." Okay, this is important. What's going to happen here? Paragraph 16 was, on the original synthetic unity of apperception. And we talked about the synthetic unity of apperception and how all experience has to be sort of referred to it, belong to it. Now, this principle of the synthetic unity of apperception is identified to be the supreme principle of all use of the understanding. Right now the understanding comes into play. Right now we get to hear, and this maybe sort of explains what Kant was saying in paragraph 15 about spontaneity and the use of the understanding there. Kant is now going to tell us that this principle of the synthetic unity of apperception is going to be the principle of all use of the understanding, right? And so the understanding is involved in this unity. This is not a unity that has nothing to do with the understanding. This unity is, in a sense, affected by the understanding, right? The act of synthesis, or this synthesis of all experiences in this transcendental unity of apperception, is an act of synthesis by the understanding. Okay, that is what Kant is going to tell us here. So we hear, the supreme principle of all intuition in relation to the understanding is that all the manifold of intuition stand under conditions of the original synthetic unity of apperception. Okay, that's basically what the title said, right? That the manifold of intuition stands under conditions of the original synthetic unity of apperception, we learned in 16, that this is the supreme principle of all intuition in relation to the understanding, is what is new in 17. All the manifold representations of intuition stand under the first principle insofar as they are given to us, and under the second insofar as they must be capable of being combined in one consciousness. For without that, nothing could be thought or cognized through them, since the given representations would not have in common the act of apperception, I think, and thereby would not be grasped together in a self-consciousness. Another hot button issue in Kant commentary is whether Kant thinks that that anything can be given in intuition alone, right, without the use of the understanding. Now, what this certainly makes clear is that, if anything could be given to us in intuition without the understanding being involved, it would be something that could not be related to the I think, and thereby would not be grasped together in a self-consciousness. It's kind of hard to see how, in what sense it could be given without being brought under this I think and be grasped together in a self-consciousness. Right? So maybe there is some sense of being given in which that is true, but it's not a very strong sense of being given. It's maybe not even a sense of being given that we can fully understand. So it seems to me, at least, that Kant is walking a road here in which he suggests that, okay, it was really kind of nice in the transcendental aesthetic to talk about objects being given to us in sensibility. But what we are now realize is that for them to be given to us in sensibility, they have to be related to the I think, and it turns out that the understanding is always going to have to be involved in that. And that, of course, even if it's not required, it's certainly, a helpful step in trying to show that the categories will apply to the objects of intuition. Because if the understanding is always already involved in anything being given to us in intuition, it certainly seems a lot less problematic to claim that the categories are going to be applicable to the objects of intuition, the objects that are given to us in intuition. Whereas if intuition is something that all by itself gives us objects, okay, why would the categories apply to them? So that also is something that is good to keep in mind here, right? What is Kant saying? What is he thinking about the relation between intuition and concepts? Is it possible for anything to be given in intuition without concepts sort of already being involved? Well, here at least Kant seems to be telling us that the understanding has to be involved if whatever is given to us is to be given to us, right? To this unity of self-consciousness. Now, the understanding is generally speaking the faculty of cognitions. These consist in the determinate relation of given representations to an object. Here the word object comes in. Right? So we were talking about the understanding, now we're going to talk about objects. An object, however, is that in the concept of which the manifold of a given intuition is united. Now, however, all unification of representations requires unity of consciousness in the synthesis of them. Consequently, the unity of consciousness is that which alone constitutes the relation of representations to an object, thus their objective validity, and consequently is that which makes them into cognitions and on which even the possibility of the understanding rests. Let's read that again. So the understanding is generally speaking the faculty of cognitions. Okay. These consist in the determinate relation of given representations to an object. Right? We talked about this. And that an object is that in the concept of which the manifold of a given intuition is united. Concepts are for objects are what we sort of posit, what we sort of think when we think of the manifold of a given intuition as being united, right? And again, being united means belonging together, right? An object is that which grounds the belonging together of the different elements of intuition. That is how I explained it before, and is how I'm going to be explaining it now too. Again, so I think I gave this example of a pencil, right? When I think of this pencil as a yellow pencil, I am thinking a bunch of things given to me in intuition as belonging together, right? Actually, a whole lot of things, not just the color and the shape, but also, I guess, the different elements of sort of the shape, the purpose of the thing, its rigidity, its history, its future. There's actually a lot going on when I think the thought of an object in my normal empirical thinking. But the basic underlying idea that an object is that in the concept of which the manifold of a given intuition is united, right? Is united is the same thing as is being thought as a unity. Now, however, all unification of representations requires unity of consciousness in the synthesis of them, right? If I am to think an object, I've got to be unifying those elements. Right? If I am uniting something, I can only do that through the unity of my self-consciousness. If the different elements of the object were somehow dispersed in different consciousnesses, which did not form a single self-consciousness, there wouldn't be any unification taking place. So, all unification of representations requires unity of consciousness in the synthesis of them. And it doesn't just require all of these elements to belong to the same consciousness. It requires this consciousness to be aware of them as being thought as a unity, right? So it requires a consciousness in the synthesis of them. It requires this self-consciousness of the very act of synthesis, of the very act of thinking them as belonging objectively together. Consequently, the unity of consciousness is that which alone constitutes the relation of representations to an object, thus their objective validity, and consequently is that which makes them into cognitions and on which even the possibility of the understanding rests. Okay, let's think about that. The unity of consciousness is that which alone constitutes the relation of representations to an object. The way I see this is that in a sense, Kant's story is pretty sparse, right? I mean, there are these elements of intuition, and I'm bringing them together, right? I'm thinking them together in this idea of an object. But this togetherness consists of nothing but there is nothing else for it to be than being brought together in this one self-consciousness. Right, so the way that I'm reading this at the moment is I'm reading this as a sort of, okay, I mean, the only thing that this unity could consist in, this unity of the object, is this unity of is being referred to, is being brought together in this unity of self-consciousness. And so the unity of consciousness is that which alone constitutes the relation of representations to an object, thus their objective validity, and consequently it is that which makes them into cognitions and on which even the possibility of the understanding rests. And then a little later on, Kant goes on to say, and I'm at B138, just a little later, the synthetic unity of consciousness is therefore an objective condition of all cognition, not merely something I myself need in order to cognize an object, but rather something under which every intuition must stand in order to become an object for me, since in any other way, and without this synthesis, the manifold would not be united in one consciousness. Okay, so what Kant has been telling us here, or what he has been trying to explain to us, is that the uniting of the manifold that is given to us in intuition must be done by thinking it as an object. That's basically what thinking a unity in a manifold comes down to. It's thinking of it as grounded in this object, this rule, as we have seen earlier, this necessity, although Kant doesn't use that terminology here. And this is only possible, this requires, in fact, this comes down to being united in this unity of self-consciousness. And so we have a relation here between self-consciousness, the unifying of the manifold, in the thought of an object, right? It's the understanding that thinks something as an object, and that is how this manifold is united in a single self-consciousness. That is sort of the schematic picture here. And so Kant is doing something that is extremely important for his purposes, which is bringing together the idea of the self-consciousness, the idea of the understanding, the idea of an object, and the idea of the manifold that is given in intuition. All of these, Kant is telling us, sort of necessarily belong together, and we can't really have any of that without having all of the others. Okay, let's take a little break before we move on to paragraphs 18 to 20.